The little black girl grabbed the biker at the freight gate, claiming someone tracked her route since dawn. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's incredible story. It was just after dawn when a small figure emerged from the shadows near the freight gate of a busy shipping yard. A little black girl, no more than 10 years old, her face streaked with dirt, her eyes wide with fear, stumbled toward the entrance, her bare feet slapping against the cold concrete. She was crying, but there was no time to waste. She had to find help. As she neared the entrance, she spotted a lone figure leaning against a motorcycle. The biker was tall, his leather jacket worn, the patches on his back showing years of experience, a man hardened by life's battles. He looked up, catching sight of her frantic approach. Before he could even move, she was already there, grabbing his sleeve, her voice trembling with panic. Please help me. Someone's been following me all day, since dawn. They're trying to catch me. The biker froze for a second, his eyes scanning the girl's face. He could see the raw fear, the desperation in her eyes. He'd been around long enough to recognize when someone was in real danger. He pulled her close, tried to calm her down. Take a deep breath. You're safe here, he said, his voice steady but laced with concern. The girl's shaking hands gripped his jacket tighter, and through her sobs, she managed to say, "They've been watching me since I left the house. I don't know what to do, please." The biker looked around, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. The last thing he wanted was to get involved in something dangerous, but there was something about this girl that told him she wasn't lying. He had to help her. Without hesitation, he nodded to her, signaling that he would follow. "Where are we going?" he asked gently. "I'll take you somewhere safe." She hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting around as if she was checking for any sign of the person who had been trailing her. "To the warehouse. The one at the edge of town," she whispered. The biker's instincts kicked in. He didn't like the sound of it, but she was a kid, alone and scared, and he wasn't about to leave her there. "All right, let's get going," he said, pulling her onto his bike. As he started the engine, he felt the weight of the responsibility settle over him. This wasn't going to be an easy ride, but he wasn't backing down. Not for her. Not for anyone. The bike roared to life, and the two of them sped off into the streets, leaving the freight yard behind them. The sound of the motorcycle was drowned out by the pounding of her heart in her chest. As they rode, the girl clung to him, not speaking, but her grip telling him all he needed to know. The fear was still there, but for the first time since she had run from the house, she felt a glimmer of safety. However, as they neared the outskirts of town, a dark figure in a silver SUV appeared in their rearview mirror, following closely behind. The biker glanced back, his grip tightening on the handlebars. The chase had begun. Ignoring the roar of the motorcycle beneath them, the biker could feel the girl's grip tighten around his waist as they sped through the streets. The silver SUV behind them had been tailing them for miles, never quite losing sight of their bike. Each time he glanced in the rearview mirror, the SUV was closer, its headlights now flashing in the growing twilight like a predator closing in on its prey. The girl, still clinging to him, glanced over her shoulder, her breath quickening as she saw the vehicle behind them. "They're getting closer," she whispered, her voice trembling. The biker nodded, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This wasn't just some random follower. This was a threat. He pushed the bike harder, the engine responding with a growl as they tore through the streets of the small town, the road ahead of them becoming a blur. He needed to lose the SUV, but the back roads were narrow and winding. He glanced at the girl. "Hold on tight," he said, his voice gruff but calm. She nodded without a word, her body pressed tightly against his, and he could feel her heart racing in her chest. They turned onto a winding road that led to the outskirts of town, hoping to outrun the SUV, but it was still there, just behind them. "I can't shake it," the biker muttered to himself. He pushed the throttle harder, the bike picking up speed, but the SUV matched their pace. The tension was unbearable, and the streetlights they passed flickered above them like warning signs. They were running out of time. The bike swerved around a corner sharply, sending the girl's hair flying behind her as she gripped tighter, but the SUV was still right there, closing in. "What do they want?" the girl asked, her voice strained with fear. The biker didn't answer. He knew what was at stake. Whatever this was, it was personal. This wasn't just some random kidnapping attempt. This was something bigger. They came upon a dead-end street lined with old warehouses. The road had narrowed to just a single lane, and the bike was struggling to maintain its speed. The biker's eyes scanned the area frantically. He could see the buildings up ahead, their broken windows reflecting the pale moonlight. "We got to make a stand," he thought. There was no way to outrun them now. He slammed the brakes hard, the bike sliding to a stop just as the SUV approached. The girl's scream was drowned out by the screech of the tires as the SUV came to a halt a few feet behind them. The engine hummed ominously, and the biker stood up, pulling the girl off the bike with him. He pushed her behind him, instinctively positioning himself as a shield. The doors of the SUV opened slowly, and two men stepped out, their faces partially obscured by the shadows. The biker's grip on the girl tightened. This was it, the moment he had been dreading. One of the men stepped forward, his voice cold and steady as he spoke. "Give her to us. Now," he demanded, his hand reaching toward the girl. The biker stepped forward, his own voice low and dangerous. Not a chance. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. These guys weren't just some random thugs. They were serious. The air was thick with tension, the only sound the hum of the SUV's engine and the distant rustling of wine through the empty street. The man who had spoken before smirked. "You really think you can stop us?" he said, his tone mocking. "You don't even know what you're up against." The biker didn't flinch. "I don't care what you think you are. This girl's under my protection, and I don't break promises." The man's smirk faded, replaced by a dark look of frustration. "Then you're going to regret this." The moment he finished speaking, he lunged forward. The biker reacted in an instant, knocking the man back with a powerful shove. He moved quickly, his hands ready to defend the girl behind him. The other man was already circling, trying to flank him, but the biker was faster, his experience in dealing with threats making him move with precision. He blocked the incoming punch with his forearm, then delivered a quick jab to the man's stomach. The man staggered back, winded. The first man recovered quickly, pulling out a knife, its blade gleaming in the dim light. The biker stepped into a defensive stance, his focus sharp. He could hear the girl behind him, her breathing shaky but steady, knowing that her safety was in his hands. He wasn't going to let them take her. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for a promise he made 5 years ago. The knife slashed through the air as the man lunged forward again. The biker sidestepped, his fist connecting with the man's jaw. He felt the impact, but there was no time to savor it. The second man lunged again, and the biker twisted, using the man's own momentum against him, sending him crashing to the ground. The first man staggered back, a look of disbelief on his face. The girl behind him was safe, for now, but the danger wasn't over yet. The fight was far from finished, and the stakes were higher than ever. The man who had lunged at the biker with the knife was now on the ground, groaning as he struggled to push himself up. The biker's eyes were fixed on him, but his focus never wavered. The second man, now on his feet, was seething with rage. His eyes burned with fury as he glared at the biker. The girl, still behind the biker, trembled, clutching his jacket tightly. Her breath came in shallow gasps, but she didn't make a sound. She knew she was safe for now, but she also knew that the danger wasn't over. The first man, blood dripping from his lip, slowly pulled himself into a crouching position. "You should have just walked away," he spat, his voice thick with anger. "But now you've made it personal." The biker didn't reply. He kept his eyes on the man, every muscle in his body coiled, ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. The second man, realizing that his partner wasn't in any condition to fight, pulled out a gun. The cold metal gleamed in the faint light of the street lamp. "Step aside," he ordered, pointing the gun at the biker. The biker's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't flinch. He stood his ground, the girl still huddled behind him, her body shaking. "You don't want to do this," the biker said, his voice low and steady. He didn't raise his hands or make any sudden moves. He knew what could happen if he gave the wrong impression. "You don't know who you're dealing with," the second man growled. He took a step forward, his finger tightening on the trigger. But before he could take another step, a loud sound echoed through the night. The roar of engines, followed by the unmistakable sound of a dozen bikes speeding toward them. The biker turned his head just as the headlights of the motorcycles illuminated the street. The second man's face went pale, and for the first time, doubt flashed in his eyes. The motorcycles came into view, their engines deafening as they revved louder and louder. The biker didn't need to look back to know who was riding toward him. It was his club, the Thunderwolves, and they were ready to back him up, no questions asked. As the first bike skidded to a halt, the sound of the roaring engines faded into silence. The man with the gun froze, his hand still raised, the barrel pointing directly at the biker. He glanced around, his eyes darting from the biker to the incoming bikers. They were outnumbered now. The biker smiled. "Looks like you're out of options," he said, his voice calm, but with an edge. The men from his club dismounted, one by one, their leather jackets gleaming in the moonlight. The first man with the knife seemed to hesitate, but only for a moment. He quickly made up his mind and bolted for the SUV, his footsteps pounding against the pavement. The second man stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. "I don't want any trouble," he muttered, his voice low. The biker stepped forward, still keeping the girl behind him, shielded from view. "Then leave. Now," the biker said, his voice filled with authority. The man looked at the bikers, then at the ground, his face a mixture of frustration and fear. Without another word, he turned and sprinted toward the SUV, disappearing into the night. The rest of the bikers stood still, their eyes never leaving the scene. They knew that while the immediate danger had passed, the girl was far from safe. The biker turned to the girl, his expression softening. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. She nodded slowly, tears still in her eyes, but there was a small glimmer of relief in her gaze. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. He reached out, gently patting her on the shoulder. "You're safe now. You're with us." He looked back at his club, who had formed a tight circle around them. "We need to get her to safety. We're not done yet." The girl nodded again, clutching his jacket tighter as they all began to move. The bikers formed a protective barrier around her, their eyes scanning every corner of the street, every shadow. They had made a promise to protect her, and they would see it through, no matter what it took. As they moved toward the nearby warehouse, the girl walked between the bikers, still in shock, but feeling a small sense of security that she hadn't felt in a long time. She was no longer alone. She was no longer running. And as the bikers began to organize, readying themselves for whatever came next, the threat was far from over. The question was no longer if they would make it to safety, but what price they would have to pay to ensure that she remained safe. And that was a price they were all willing to pay. The warehouse loomed ahead, its dark silhouette standing against the backdrop of the night sky. The air was thick with tension as the bikers carefully maneuvered. The girl through the large metal doors. The sound of their boots echoed through the empty space as they set up a perimeter, ensuring that no one could sneak up on them. The girl, still shaken, clung to the biker who had first protected her, her small hand gripping his jacket tightly. "We're safe for now," the biker said quietly, though the uncertainty in his voice revealed the worry he was trying to mask. Inside the warehouse, the space was cold, the metal walls echoing every movement, adding to the sense of isolation. The bikers quickly spread out, keeping watch while others took a seat, their eyes never leaving the door. The girl, her face pale and streaked with tears, sat on an overturned crate, her legs pulled up to her chest. She looked around, her eyes darting to each biker, as if trying to reassure herself that she was truly safe. The biker who had been closest to her knelt beside her, his face softening as he looked at her. "You're safe here," he said again, more for his own reassurance than hers. She nodded silently, not trusting her voice. The sound of approaching footsteps caught their attention. A few of the bikers tensed, ready to spring into action, but it was only one of the members of the crew coming back from a sweep of the perimeter. No sign of anyone nearby, the biker reported, his face grim. But they're close. I can feel it. The biker who had been guarding the girl stood up, a grim look on his face. We need to keep moving. We can't stay here long. The tension in the air was palpable. The girl could feel it, and it made her stomach twist with anxiety. "What's going to happen to me?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. The biker paused for a moment, his eyes meeting hers. He didn't have an answer. He couldn't promise her that everything would be okay. He could only promise that he would protect her, no matter what it took. "You're not alone anymore," he said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet determination. "We'll keep you safe." The girl didn't say anything more, but she nodded, trusting the words, even if they were the only comfort she had left. The rest of the bikers gathered around, forming a tight circle. There were no more words, only actions. They began to prepare, gathering what they could in the way of supplies, weapons, and tools. There was no telling what would come next, but they all knew one thing. They weren't going down without a fight. As the minutes passed, the tension in the air grew thicker. Every sound outside the warehouse made the group jump. Every creak of the metal walls was met with nervous glances. The girl could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her, and despite the bikers' calm demeanor, she could see the unease in their eyes. They were worried. The door to the warehouse creaked open slightly, and the biker who had been standing watch at the entrance quickly moved toward it, his hand gripping the handle of his motorcycle helmet like it was a weapon. He peered out into the night, his eyes scanning the darkness. The others held their breath, waiting for his signal. Finally, he stepped back, his eyes narrowed in concentration. "It's them," he said, his voice low. "They found us." The bikers sprang into action. They quickly checked their weapons and prepared themselves for whatever was about to come through that door. The girl's heart raced as she stood up, the fear rising in her chest. She had no idea who these people were or what they wanted from her, but one thing was clear. They weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. The bikers spread out, taking strategic positions around the warehouse. The doors opened wider, and a figure stepped inside, silhouetted by the dim light from the street outside. The girl's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the person who had been following her all day. It was the man she had feared, the man who had been trailing her since dawn. He stepped into the warehouse, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on her. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice cold and menacing. The biker closest to the girl stepped forward, his stance defensive, ready to protect her at any cost. The tension in the room was unbearable as the two sides faced off, each waiting for the other to make the first move. The girl stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest as the confrontation unfolded in front of her. She had no idea what was going to happen next, but she knew one thing. She wasn't alone anymore. She had the bikers, and they would fight for her no matter what it took. The man stepped further into the warehouse, his presence filling the space like a dark cloud. His cold, steely gaze was fixed on the girl, who now stood trembling behind the biker who had sworn to protect her. The tension in the air was suffocating, and the other bikers took their positions, surrounding the girl, their eyes never leaving the man who dared to threaten her. "You really think you can stop me?" the man sneered, his voice sharp and cruel. The biker who stood closest to the girl tightened his grip on his helmet, his jaw set in determination. "You've been chasing her all day. This ends now." The man didn't flinch. Instead, he pulled something from his coat, a badge. "You don't know who I am. I'm Officer Ryan Miller, and I don't take kindly to people interfering with my business." The room fell into an eerie silence as the bikers exchanged wary glances. The badge didn't just make the situation complicated, it made it dangerous. The girl's eyes widened as she recognized the badge, her fear intensifying. "You don't need to do this," the biker said, his voice firm but not without a hint of concern. "Let her go. She's not your property." Officer Miller's lips curled into a smile, though it was more like a sneer. "Property?" he mocked. "She's just a girl who doesn't know when to stay quiet." I should have dealt with her long ago. But now, you're all in the way. The tension thickened as the biker stepped forward, positioning himself between the girl and Officer Miller. You'll have to go through me first, he said, his voice low and unwavering. Officer Miller's expression darkened. I'd prefer not to make a scene, he said, his hand inching toward his holstered gun. But if you insist on this, I won't hesitate to put you down. The biker's hands instinctively moved to the grips of their own weapons, the air heavy with the promise of violence. The girl's heart pounded in her chest as she clung to the biker behind her. Please, she whispered, barely audible. I'm scared. The biker's heart clenched. He could feel her fear like it was his own. He wanted to reassure her, tell her everything would be okay, but he knew they were walking a fine line. One wrong move, and it could all go south. Officer Miller took another step forward, his eyes never leaving the biker in front of him. This doesn't have to go any further, he said, his voice colder now. But I'll warn you, I'm not leaving here without her, and I will make sure none of you leave either. The bikers didn't flinch, their resolve only growing stronger. You're not getting her, the biker said. Not now. Not ever. The man's hand hovered over his gun, and for a brief moment, the whole room held its breath. It was clear that the situation was spiraling towards something violent. And yet, the bikers held their ground, knowing that they couldn't let Officer Miller take the girl. Enough! A voice suddenly cut through the tension. It was a calm, steady voice, one that carried weight and authority. The bikers looked up in unison as another figure stepped forward, a woman dressed in a leather jacket and a helmet tucked under her arm. She wasn't as tall as the men, but she exuded a quiet strength. Her eyes locked onto Officer Miller's with an intensity that was impossible to ignore. You're done here, she said, her voice unwavering. Officer Miller's eyes flickered with surprise, then narrowed in recognition. You think you can intimidate me? He growled. The woman stepped closer, her boots clicking against the concrete floor. I don't need to intimidate you, she said. I just need you to walk away. Now, the man hesitated, clearly unsure of how to proceed. The tension was palpable, each second feeling like an eternity. Officer Miller glanced around to the bikers, their eyes cold and resolute. He had come here expecting to overpower them, but now he was starting to realize that this wasn't a fight he could win. Not today. Slowly, he stepped back, his hands still hovering over his gun, but no longer advancing. You won't get away with this, he muttered, his voice low with frustration. The woman didn't flinch. You're already gone, she said, her words carrying the finality of a verdict. With that, Officer Miller turned and walked out, his footsteps echoing in the warehouse as he retreated. The bikers exhaled in unison, the weight of the confrontation lifting as the immediate danger passed. The girl, still shaken, slowly looked up at the woman who had spoken. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The woman smiled gently and knelt beside her. You're safe now, she said softly, her hand resting on the girl's shoulder. The bikers began to relax, but the woman's eyes remained sharp, scanning the warehouse for any other signs of danger. We need to get out of here, she said, standing up. We're not safe just yet. The bikers nodded, moving quickly to gather their things and make sure the girl was safe. The woman's voice carried a sense of calm authority, but the girl could see the quiet strength in her eyes. She wasn't just a biker, she was a protector. And as the girl stood there, finally starting to feel a sense of safety, she realized that she had found something she had longed for, a family that would never let her down. The bikers quickly moved into action, their pace quickening as the gravity of the situation settled over them. They were now on high alert, their eyes scanning every corner of the warehouse for any signs of danger. The girl, still shaken, was now at the center of their attention, and the bikers were more determined than ever to protect her. The woman, who had been the calm voice of reason during the confrontation, took the lead, her presence commanding as she made sure everything was in order. She was a woman of few words, but her authority was undeniable. We don't have much time, she said, her voice low but filled with urgency. The bikers nodded in unison, understanding that they couldn't afford to waste a single moment. The girl's fear was palpable, her eyes darting nervously between the bikers. But there was also a flicker of hope in her expression. For the first time in what seemed like forever, she wasn't alone. The woman turned to the girl, her tone softening. "You're safe now," she said, trying to offer some comfort, though she knew the girl wasn't out of danger just yet. "But we need to move quickly. We're going to get you somewhere where no one can find you." The girl looked up at her, still unsure, but starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could protect her. "Where will we go?" she asked, her voice shaky. The woman's eyes were sharp, scanning the area one last time before giving her answer. "We're heading to the safe house," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "It's secure. No one will find you there." The bikers started to pack up, quickly gathering their gear and making sure they were ready for whatever was next. The woman kept an eye on the girl, her gaze never wavering from her, as if silently reassuring her that they weren't going to let anything happen to her. As the bikers prepared to leave, the atmosphere was thick with tension. They knew they weren't out of danger yet. Officer Miller had already shown his hand, and they had no doubt that more trouble was on its way. The woman approached the girl one last time, her face softening as she knelt down to her level. "Stay close to us," she said gently. "We're going to get you to safety. No one will hurt you." The girl nodded, her wide eyes filled with both fear and gratitude. The bikers, led by the woman, filed out of the warehouse in formation, their engines roaring to life as they prepared for the next leg of the journey. The sun had long set, and the cool night air bit at their skin, but none of them seemed to notice. Their focus was singular, keeping the girl safe, no matter the cost. As they sped through the streets, the headlights of the motorcycles cutting through the darkness, the woman glanced over her shoulder at the girl. "You're doing great," she said, offering a small smile. "Just a little longer, and you'll be where you're safe." But even as she spoke those words, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Officer Miller wasn't the only one after the girl. There were bigger forces at play here, and the bikers knew it. They had no idea who else was involved or how deep this went, but they were determined to find out. The group sped through the winding roads, leaving the city behind as they headed into the more remote areas. The further they went, the more isolated they became. It was a quiet ride, the only sound being the rumbling of the bikes and the wind rushing past them. The girl had settled into the back of the lead motorcycle, her body still tense, but no longer trembling with fear. She was starting to trust. These bikers, starting to believe that they would keep their word. The woman, riding at the front of the group, didn't take her eyes off the road, her mind racing as she thought about what they might be up against. The safe house was just ahead, but the real challenge would come when they arrived. Would it be enough to keep the girl hidden? Or was it just another temporary refuge before the danger found them again? The uncertainty was overwhelming, but she pushed it aside. There was no time for doubt. They were almost there. As the group approached the safe house, the woman gave a signal, and the bikers slowed down, their movements deliberate and cautious. They could see the lights of the house ahead, a beacon in the distance. But as they drew closer, a familiar shape emerged from the shadows. A black SUV, the same one that had been following them, was parked outside the house, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The woman's heart skipped a beat. "Stay behind me," she said, her voice low but filled with authority. The bikers immediately moved into position, their weapons ready. The girl's heart raced again as she looked at the SUV, fear creeping back in her chest. "They found us," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I thought we were safe." The woman turned to her, her face hardening. "We're not going to let them take you. Not now. Not ever." The bikers formed a protective barrier around the girl as they approached the SUV. The woman's gaze remained fixed on the vehicle, her mind calculating their next move. She wasn't going to let anyone take the girl, not without a fight. The tension in the air was thick as the black SUV sat ominously in front of the safe house. The headlights shone brightly, illuminating the surroundings as the bikers gathered around the girl, forming a tight circle of protection. The woman at the front of the group didn't hesitate, her eyes never leaving the SUV. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. They had been followed, but they couldn't afford to show any fear now. The girl, still trembling but now hidden behind the bikers, clutched the leather of the woman's jacket, her eyes wide with fear. "They found us," she whispered again, her voice barely audible. "I thought we were safe." The woman turned to her, giving her a reassuring look. "You're safe here," she said firmly, though she didn't quite believe it herself. She knew they couldn't stay here long. They needed to act fast. The SUV's engine hummed, its headlights still piercing through the dark night as the bikers stood ready. The woman signaled, and the bikers began to move into position. They knew what they were up against, but this wasn't the time for hesitation. She turned to the group, her voice low but commanding. "We're not letting them take her. No one's getting through us." The bikers nodded in unison, their faces hardening. They had made a promise, and they were going to see it through, no matter the cost. The woman approached the girl one last time, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Stay behind me," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet intensity. "No matter what happens, don't leave my side." The girl nodded, her trust in the woman growing with every word. The woman then turned to face the SUV, her stance ready for whatever came next. Slowly, the door to the SUV creaked open, and a man stepped out. He was tall, wearing a dark suit, his face partially obscured by the shadows. But the moment he stepped forward, there was no mistaking his intent. He had the look of someone who thought they were in control, but the bikers weren't going to let him have that. The woman's voice was calm, but her words were sharp as she addressed the man. "This is where you stop," she said, her eyes locked onto his. "You're not taking her." The man's eyes flickered to the bikers, then to the girl hiding behind them. "I'm not asking," he replied, his voice cold and menacing. "Get out of the way, or things will get ugly." The woman didn't flinch. "We're not moving. This ends now." A tense silence fell between them as the man's hand hovered near his jacket, clearly debating his next move. The woman didn't wait. She signaled the bikers, and they spread out, taking positions around the safe house, ensuring that no one could escape and no one could get in. The man hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward. "You think you can stand up to me?" he sneered. The woman stepped forward, unflinching. "We don't need to stand up to you. We just need to keep you from hurting her." The man sneered again, his hand brushing against his jacket, as if reaching for something hidden. The air was thick with the tension of the moment, each second feeling like it might explode into chaos. But the woman remained calm, her eyes never leaving his. "You can still walk away. But if you don't, we will make sure you never threaten her again." The man's hand moved, and in an instant he pulled out a small but menacing knife. The bikers tensed, their hands on their own weapons, ready for anything. But the woman didn't flinch. She took one more step forward, her eyes locked onto his. "I warned you," she said, her voice steady. "This ends here." The man lunged, but the woman was faster. She grabbed his wrist, twisting it sharply and forcing him to drop the knife. Before he could react, she shoved him backward, sending him stumbling to the ground. The other bikers moved quickly, surrounding him and making sure he couldn't escape. The girl watched in shock, her heart pounding, but she felt a strange sense of relief. They weren't just words. They had followed through. The man struggled, but the bikers had him pinned, and there was no way out. "Get him out of here," the woman said, her voice cold as she turned her back to him. The bikers grabbed the man by the arms and dragged him toward the SUV, tossing him inside like a rag doll. They slammed the door shut, and the engine roared to life, the sound of it fading into the night. The woman turned back to the girl, her expression softening as she approached her. "You're safe now," she said, her voice warm but firm. The girl looked up at her, her eyes wide with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know what I would have done without you." The woman smiled gently, offering her a comforting hug. "You don't have to worry anymore. We've got you." As the bikers gathered around, their focus never wavering, the woman felt a small sense of relief. They had kept their promise. The girl was safe. For now, that was all that mattered. But she knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There was still more to face, more to fight for. But they were ready. Together, they would protect her, and nothing would stand in their way. The sound of the motorcycle engines gradually faded as the group moved further away from the safe house. The night was still, but the unease that had plagued them earlier still lingered. The girl, though still shaken, seemed to relax with each passing mile, her grip on the woman's jacket slowly loosening. The woman, riding at the front, stole occasional glances back at the girl, making sure she was all right. The ride had been long, and the tension was thick in the air. They were far from safe, but for now, the immediate danger had been dealt with. As they approached the edge of the forest, the woman signaled for the group to slow down. The headlights illuminated the dark path ahead, revealing an old cabin that seemed to blend into the woods. This was the next stop, the second of many places where the girl would be hidden until they figure out who was behind the attacks. "We're here," the woman said, her voice low but firm as she guided her bike to a stop in front of the cabin. The bikers followed her lead, parking their bikes and dismounting. They had reached the safe house, but there was no time to waste. The girl, now visibly exhausted, dismounted with the woman's help. "This is where you'll be safe for now," the woman said, offering a small but reassuring smile. The girl looked up at her, still processing everything that had happened. "I don't understand. Why are you helping me? Why are you doing all this?" The woman's expression softened, and for a moment, there was a flash of something personal in her eyes. "Because someone has to," she said simply. "You don't have to do this alone. You don't have to be afraid anymore." The girl nodded, her eyes starting to tear up. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't alone, and the weight that had been hanging over her for so long was starting to lift. The woman led the girl into the cabin, where the rest of the bikers were already preparing to settle in for the night. The space was small but functional. There were supplies stashed in every corner, and a few makeshift beds were set up in the back. The girl was taken to a cot where she could rest. "Get some sleep," the woman said gently. "We'll figure out our next move in the morning. For now, you're safe." The girl nodded and lay down, her body finally relaxing after what had been a day of constant fear. The woman looked around at the bikers. "We need to stay sharp. We know they're still after her, and we have no idea how deep this goes. We can't afford to let our guard down." The group nodded in agreement. The woman turned to the door, her eyes scanning the surrounding woods. They were deep in the forest now, far from civilization, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't out of danger yet. She stepped outside, the cool night air hitting her face. The wind rustled the trees around her as she walked a few steps away from the cabin. She needed to think to plan their next move. She couldn't let anything happen to the girl. She wouldn't. A soft, rustling noise broke her focus, and she turned sharply, her hand instinctively moving to the knife strapped to her waist. But it wasn't one of the bikers coming out to check on her. It was a figure standing at the edge of the forest, watching her. "You're still out here," a voice called, low and gravelly. The woman froze, recognition dawning. The figure stepped forward, revealing a man in a dark leather jacket, a familiar insignia on his back. "I told you we wouldn't let you off that easy," he said with a smirk. The woman's hand tightened on the knife, but she didn't make a move. "We're not leaving. You're not taking her," she said, her voice steady. The man laughed softly, almost as if he found her words amusing. "You think it's just you and your little club against us? You're out of your league." The woman's eyes narrowed, but she kept her stance firm. "We'll see about that." The man's smirk faded, and he took another step forward. "You've already lost," he said, his voice now laced with threat. "You just don't know it yet." The woman's hand slowly pulled away from her knife as she took a step back, sizing him up. She wasn't going to make the first move, not yet, but she knew they were being hunted, and the only way to end this was to face it head on. "I'll protect her," she said, her voice full of finality. "You can keep coming, but we're not going anywhere. And we're not backing down." The man hesitated for a moment, clearly calculating his next move. Then, with a sharp motion, he turned and walked back into the forest, disappearing into the shadows. The woman exhaled slowly, her heart still racing. The danger wasn't over, not by a long shot, but she was ready. They all were. She turned back toward the cabin, her thoughts already moving forward. They had a long fight ahead of them, But they weren't alone. They had each other, and they would do whatever it took to keep the girls safe. And she knew, without a doubt, that they were going to win. The morning light crept slowly through the trees, casting long shadows across the cabin. The woman stood near the entrance, her eyes scanning the woods, still alert after the unsettling encounter with the man the night before. The bikers had settled in for the night, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't out of danger yet. She knew that things had just gotten more complicated. As the others began to stir and prepare for the day ahead, the girl, who had been asleep on the cot in the corner, slowly woke up. Her face was still pale from the events of the past few days, but there was a subtle shift in her demeanor. The fear that had been etched into her features seemed to be easing, replaced by a quiet sense of relief. She was still scared, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like maybe, just maybe, things would be okay. The woman noticed her stirring and walked over to check on her. "How are you doing?" she asked gently, crouching down beside the cot. The girl looked up at her, her eyes still wide, but less fearful than before. "I'm okay," she said quietly, her voice soft. "I didn't know if I'd ever feel safe again." The woman smiled faintly, her heart heavy with sympathy. "You are safe. You don't have to worry anymore. We've got you." The girl nodded slowly, her eyes still filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. The woman patted her shoulder, offering reassurance with a quiet nod. But as she turned to walk away, her mind began to race. They weren't safe here. Not for long. She had a sense that the man from the night before wasn't going to give up that easily. If anything, he was just getting started. She could feel in her gut. The bikers gathered in the main room, their conversations hushed as they discussed their next move. "We need to get the girl out of here," one of them said, his voice tense. "They know we're here now. They won't stop until they get what they want." The woman nodded, her face grim. "We'll move out as soon as possible," she said, her voice steady. "But we need to make sure we're not followed." They had no intention of letting the girl be taken, but they knew that staying in one place for too long wasn't an option. They had to keep moving. The woman gathered her things, preparing for the road ahead. The girl would have to leave the cabin, and they would need to keep her hidden. They were ready for the fight, but this wasn't going to be easy. They knew that danger could strike at any moment, and they had no intention of letting their guard down. As the bikers began to prepare their bikes, the woman approached the girl once more. "We're going to get you to safety," she said quietly, her voice calm but filled with determination. The girl looked up at her, her expression still nervous but filled with trust. "I know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know you won't let anything happen to me." The woman smiled gently, her heart aching for the girl. "We won't. Not while I'm breathing." With that, the woman led the girl out of the cabin, where the rest of the bikers were already mounting their bikes. The engines roared to life, and the group began to move, leaving the cabin behind them. They headed into the forest, away from the familiar roads, and deeper into unknown territory. The woman's mind raced with every mile they covered. She was preparing for the worst, but she didn't let her fear show. The girl needed her strength now. She couldn't afford to falter. The sound of the engines echoed in the quiet of the woods, the group moving swiftly and purposefully. As they rode, the woman's gaze remained fixed on the road ahead, scanning for any signs of danger. They couldn't be too careful. They had already been followed once. There was no telling who else might be tracking them. The group moved in silence, each biker focused on the task at hand. The girl, now riding behind the woman, clung tightly to the back of the motorcycle, her eyes still darting nervously from side to side. The woman could feel the girl's unease, but she didn't say anything. She simply focused on the road, making sure they weren't being followed. Hours passed, and the group began to make their way toward a new safe house, deeper into the mountains. The higher they climbed, the more isolated they became. It was a perfect place to hide out, far from the prying eyes of anyone who might want to find them. But even as they approached their destination, the woman's sense of unease didn't lessen. They weren't safe yet, not by a long shot. As they neared the safe house, the woman signaled for the group to slow down. The bikes coasted to a stop at the edge of the forest, and the woman turned to the girl, her expression softening for the first time since they'd left the cabin. "We're almost there," she said quietly. Just a little longer, and you'll be safe. The girl nodded, her face a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The woman knew that this was only the beginning of what was to come. The danger wasn't over, but they were one step closer to keeping the girl out of harm's way. As they dismounted and approached the safe house, the woman's instincts were on high alert. They weren't alone, and she knew it. The feeling of being watched was back, stronger than ever. But for now, all they could do was wait and prepare for the fight that was coming. The stakes had never been higher, but the woman knew they were ready. They had to be, for the girl's sake. The safe house was nestled deep in the mountains, hidden from the eyes of anyone who might be searching for them. The heavy, damp air of the forest surrounded them as the bikers parked their bikes, one by one, along the rugged path leading to the cabin. The woman stood at the front, watching the horizon, her mind racing. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. They were so close to finding a moment of peace for the girl, but something in the back of her mind told her they weren't out of danger yet. The girl, still clinging to the woman's side, looked up at the cabin, her eyes wide with exhaustion and weariness. She had been through so much already, and the journey was far from over. "This is it," the woman said, her voice calm, but carrying the quiet authority that had kept the group focused through the most tense moments. She turned to face the girl, offering a reassuring smile, though it barely masked the unease she still felt. "You're safe here. Just a little longer, and we'll get you the protection you need." The girl nodded, her face still pale, but her body relaxing slightly as she let out a long breath. She had been through more than any child should have to endure, and yet she had made it this far. The woman guided her inside, where the rest of the bikers were already gathering, setting up defensive positions and ensuring the area was secure. The cabin was small, but it would do for now. It was tucked away, far from prying eyes, and that was all that mattered. As the door closed behind them, the woman took a moment to glance around at her crew. "We need to stay vigilant," she said, her voice steady but serious. "We don't know who's looking for her, but whoever it is won't stop until they get what they want. We have to keep moving." The bikers nodded in agreement. They had been trained for moments like this, always prepared for the worst, but none of them could shake the feeling that this wasn't just another random encounter. They had come across enemies before, but something about this situation felt different. The woman looked down at the girl, who had sat down on one of the chairs by the small fireplace, her hands resting in her lap. The exhaustion was evident in her eyes, but there was something else there now, too, a flicker of hope. It was small, but it was there. "How are you holding up?" the woman asked gently, kneeling beside her. The girl looked up, offering a small, tired smile. "I'm okay," she said quietly, but her voice cracked with emotion. "I don't know how much longer I can do this." The woman's heart clenched. She knew what the girl meant. The constant running, the fear, the uncertainty, it was wearing her down. But the woman wasn't about to let her give up. "You're stronger than you think," she said, her voice low and steady. "We're all here for you, and we won't stop until you're safe." The girl looked at her for a long moment, her eyes searching the woman's face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The woman smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from the girl's face. "We're not done yet," she said firmly, "but we're getting there." The woman stood and turned to the rest of the group. "We need to figure out our next move," she said, her voice filling the room. "We can't stay here long. They'll be looking for us." The bikers immediately began to strategize, discussing the best course of action. But even as they spoke, the woman couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching them. The girl had been followed for days, and that wasn't going to stop just because they had found a temporary refuge. As the conversation continued, the woman stepped outside, the cool mountain air brushing against her face as she scanned the forest around them. She had to know if they were truly alone. Her instincts were always sharp, and right now they were screaming at her. She wasn't going to let her guard down. Not yet. Not until she was certain they were safe. A rustling sound caught her attention, and she immediately tensed, her hand going to the knife strapped to her side. But it was just one of the bikers coming to check on her. "Everything good?" he asked quietly, his eyes scanning the trees behind her. The woman nodded, but she didn't take her eyes off the forest. For now, she said, her voice cold. But we can't relax. Not yet. The biker didn't argue. He knew as well as she did that the danger was far from over. He simply nodded and turned to go back inside. The woman stayed for a few more minutes, listening to the sounds of the forest. It was eerily quiet. Too quiet. She felt a chill run down her spine. They had to keep moving. She couldn't shake the feeling that the people who were after the girl were closing in on them. As she turned to rejoin the group, a flash of movement caught her eye. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. Someone, or something, was out there. She didn't know who they were or what they wanted, but she knew they weren't alone. She headed back inside quickly, her mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. The girl had no idea, but the woman knew that the next few hours would determine everything. They had to get ready for whatever was coming, and they had to do it fast. The sound of the motorcycles reverberated in the air as the bikers prepared to leave the safe house. The girl, still quiet but more composed than before, stood near the cabin's door, her small hand gripping the woman's jacket once more. The woman looked down at her, offering a reassuring smile, though inside, her nerves were on edge. The girl had endured so much already, but the danger wasn't over. The woman could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. She had to protect the girl, no matter what. "We're heading out," the woman said softly to the group, her voice carrying authority. "Keep sharp, stay close, and don't let your guard down. This isn't over yet." The bikers nodded in agreement. Each one had their own task, making sure their weapons were in place and their bikes were ready for whatever was ahead. They had already fought off one group trying to take the girl, but there was a gnawing sense in the woman's gut that this wasn't the end. Officer Miller was just one player in whatever dark game was unfolding. As the group mounted their bikes, the woman cast one last glance at the cabin, her eyes scanning the tree line. They had to leave quickly. Every second they spent there brought more risk. The girl had been running for days, and now it was their turn to take the risk. "We'll make it," the woman said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. The girl, still close by, looked up at her, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "Will I ever be safe?" she asked softly. The woman gave her a small but firm smile, her gaze unwavering. "You will be. We're not letting anyone hurt you again." With that, the group roared off into the forest, the bikes cutting through the dense trees with speed and purpose. The roads were rugged, but the woman was used to this. Biking was as much a part of her life as breathing. But as they rode deeper into the woods, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was too quiet, too still. The girl, clutching tightly to the woman's back, stayed silent, her body pressed against hers as the trees passed in a blur. Despite the promise of safety, she could sense the girl's anxiety. It wasn't just the fear of being followed. It was something deeper, something the woman couldn't quite place. They had reached a more isolated area of the woods when the woman's sharp eyes caught a glimpse of movement in the distance, a flash of light from the tree line. It was brief, but enough to make her heart rate quicken. She signaled to the group to slow down, her instincts taking over. "Everyone hold up," she muttered, her voice low. The bikers immediately slowed, their engines humming softly as they stopped just short of the clearing. The woman dismounted quickly, her eyes scanning the trees for any sign of danger. Her gut told her they weren't alone, and she trusted that feeling more than anything else. The girl slid off the bike as well, standing behind the woman, her hand gripping her sleeve once more. The woman took a step forward, her gaze piercing the trees as her other hand rested on the handle of her knife. "Stay close," she whispered to the girl. "We don't know who's out there, but we're ready for whatever comes." The bikers spread out, taking defensive positions, their eyes darting between the trees and the woman, who was now listening intently. It wasn't long before they heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching in the underbrush. The woman held up her hand, signaling the others to remain still. She wasn't sure who or what it was, but she wasn't taking any chances. "Who's there?" she called into the woods, her voice steady. Silence. Then a rustling sound. Someone was moving toward them. The woman's heart raced, but she kept her focus. The girl stood behind her, peering over her shoulder. "Please don't let them take me," she whispered, her voice full of fear. The woman turned slightly, offering her a reassuring nod. "We're not letting anyone take you. I promise." Then, out of the shadows, a figure stepped forward, a man, his hands raised in a peaceful gesture. The woman tensed immediately, her body going rigid as she watched him. The man was wearing a dark jacket and had an almost inconspicuous look about him, his face partially hidden in the shadows. "I'm not here to fight," the man said in a low voice, his hands still raised. "But you need to listen. They're coming. They know where you are." The woman's eyes narrowed as she assessed him. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice sharp. The man lowered his hand slowly, revealing a patch on his jacket that matched the insignia of the group who had been chasing the girl. The woman's jaw clenched. "You're one of them." The man shook his head. "No, I'm not. I'm trying to help you." The woman didn't relax, her body still poised for action. "If you want to help, then get to the point. We don't have time for games." The man glanced at the girl, then back at the woman. "They're coming for her," he repeated, his voice urgent. "The ones who are after her. They have more people, more resources. You're not safe here. You need to keep moving." The woman's heart raced as the weight of his words sank in. She had known it wasn't over, but hearing this stranger confirm her fears made it all the more real. The girl behind her clutched her sleeve tighter, her face pale with dread. "We'll get her to safety," the woman said, her voice resolute. "And if they try to stop us, they'll have to go through us." The man stepped forward, lowering his voice even more. "I don't want to be your enemy," he said, his tone sincere. "But you need to trust me on this. The clock is ticking." The woman didn't respond immediately. She weighed his words, then glanced at her crew. They were ready for whatever came next, but the man's warning couldn't be ignored. It wasn't safe here anymore. "All right," she said, her voice firm. "We move out. Now." The woman nodded to her crew, signaling for them to prepare. The urgency in the man's voice hadn't been lost on her, and despite the reservations that still lingered, she knew that staying in one place was no longer an option. The man had warned them, and she trusted his information, even though it was a risk. They had to move quickly. As the bikers began to gear up, the woman turned to the girl, who had grown quiet again, her expression still clouded with uncertainty. "It's going to be all right," the woman said, kneeling in front of her. The girl met her gaze, searching for reassurance. "I don't want to run anymore," she whispered, her voice cracking with the weight of her fear. The woman's heart ached for her. "I know you don't, but we're not running from this. We're fighting, and we'll get through it." The girl nodded, though her hands still trembled as she stood and followed the woman. They were walking straight into the unknown, but for the first time, the girl felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, they would make it. The bikers finished preparing their bikes, and the group moved out, riding single file down the rugged path through the forest. The air was thick with tension, but the roar of the engines helped drown out the rising fear. Every rider kept their eyes peeled, watching for any sign that they were being followed. The woman kept a steady pace, her eyes never leaving the road ahead. She was used to the adrenaline, the constant readiness to face danger. But even with all the experience, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was different. The man's warning echoed in her mind. They had to keep moving, stay ahead of whoever was tracking them. As they pushed forward, the road began to twist and turn, the trees growing thicker and more oppressive. It wasn't long before the woman signaled for the group to slow down. Something didn't feel right. The air felt heavier, and the shadows in the trees seemed to stretch further, as if they were closing in on them. The woman felt a cold chill down her spine. "Hold up," she muttered, her voice barely audible. The bikers immediately slowed, and they came to a stop at the edge of a clearing. The woman scanned the area, her instincts on high alert. The silence of the forest felt unnatural, like the calm before a storm. "What's wrong?" one of the bikers asked, his eyes darting to the woods. "Something's off," the woman said, her voice low. "Stay sharp. We're not alone." As the group dismounted, the tension in the air thickened. The girl stood behind. The woman, her hands clutching the jacket tightly as her eyes darted nervously around. She could feel it too, the sense of being watched. The woman motioned for the group to spread out, each biker taking a position to keep a lookout. She moved cautiously toward the edge of the clearing, her hand resting on her weapon. A crackling noise came from the woods, followed by a faint rustle of leaves. The woman froze, every muscle in her body tensed. She could hear it now, the sound of footsteps moving through the underbrush. "Stay low," she whispered, her voice commanding. The group crouched down, their eyes scanning the darkness of the trees. The girl's heart pounded in her chest, her breath shallow as she clung to the woman's side. "Please don't let them take me," she whispered again, her voice filled with desperation. The woman placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "They won't," she said firmly, though inside she felt the gnawing uncertainty. The sound of movement grew louder, closer now. The woman's hand tightened around her weapon as she prepared for what might come next. Then a figure emerged from the trees, moving slowly into the clearing. It was another man, dressed in dark clothing and holding a gun. He stopped when he saw the bikers, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation. The woman's instincts kicked in, and she immediately positioned herself between the man and the girl. "Stay back," she warned, her voice steady but fierce. The man didn't move closer, but he didn't back away either. "I'm not here to fight," he said, his voice low and calm. "But you need to listen." The woman didn't trust him, not for a second. "Listen to what?" she demanded, her voice hard. The man's gaze shifted toward the girl, and he took a slow step forward. "I'm not the one you should be worried about," he said, his voice edged with a hint of urgency. "There are more coming. They're closer than you think." The woman's heart skipped a beat. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice now cold. The man's expression softened for a moment. "I'm not your enemy," he said, his eyes scanning the woods. "But you need to move. Now." The woman glanced back at the bikers. The tension in the air was palpable, but they were ready. The girl's hand gripped her sleeve. Once more, but this time there was something else in her eyes. A glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could make it through this. The woman turned back to the man. "You've got one chance. If you're lying, we'll deal with you," she said, her tone unwavering. The man nodded, his eyes focused on the group. "Let's go," he said. "We don't have much time." The bikers quickly mounted their bikes again, the woman signaling for the girl to get on. As they revved their engines and began moving forward, the man fell in a step behind them. The woman's eyes remained alert, scanning the trees as they rode, knowing that they weren't out of the woods yet. But this time, they were moving forward, one step closer to safety. And that was all that mattered. The sun had begun to rise, its soft glow cutting through the trees as the bikers made their way down the winding mountain road. The woman at the front of the group stayed alert, her eyes scanning the surroundings, feeling the weight of the past few days in every muscle of her body. They had been on the move for so long, but this time, the road ahead felt different, less tense, but still fraught with danger. The girl, sitting behind her, was quieter now, the exhaustion of the journey beginning to take its toll. The woman stole a glance over her shoulder, her heart aching at the sight of the girl, her face still marked by fear, but also a flicker of something else. Hope. It was a fragile thing, but it was there, and it made all the difference. The woman had promised her safety, and no matter how many times they were forced to run, she would keep that promise. The group rode in silence for a while, the only sounds being the roar of the engines and the wind rushing past them. But the woman's mind was racing, calculating their next move. They needed to stay one step ahead of whoever was after the girl, and though they had made it this far, she knew they couldn't stop. The girl was their responsibility now. The woman's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden movement ahead, a figure emerging from the trees. Her hand instinctively went to her knife, but as the figure stepped closer, she relaxed. It was the man who had warned them. Last night, the one who had led them out of danger. He was standing in the middle of the road, his face grim but determined. "You're not out of the woods yet," he said, his voice low. The woman pulled her bike to a stop, the rest of the group following suit. The man's eyes flickered to the girl, who was now clutching the woman's jacket again, her anxiety returning. "They know where you're headed," the man continued. "I've been keeping an eye on the road ahead. You got maybe an hour before they catch up to you. The woman's heart sank. They couldn't afford to stop, not now. How much longer do we have? She asked, her voice tight. You'll need to head for the old warehouse district, the man said, pointing down the road. There's a safe house there. It's a long shot, but it's your best chance. The woman hesitated, then nodded. They had no other choice. All right, she said, turning back to the group. We're heading to the warehouse district. Keep your eyes open. She turned back to the man. And you? What happens to you? The man shrugged, his eyes dark. I've done what I can. I'll cover your back as long as I can. But after that, you're on your own. The woman didn't like the sound of that, but she didn't have time to argue. Stay safe, she said, her voice firm. With one last look, she signaled to the group to move out, and they sped off again, the engines roaring to life. The road ahead was increasingly treacherous, with sharp turns and winding hills that slowed their progress. But the woman pushed forward. They couldn't afford to waste time. The girl's life was on the line. As they neared the warehouse district, the woman's grip on the handlebars tightened. The area was isolated, dark, and industrial. If anyone was following them, they'd have to be careful not to attract attention. The group slowed as they entered the district, their eyes scanning the shadows. The warehouses loomed around them like silent sentinels, abandoned and forgotten. The woman led the group to a large, crumbling building that looked more like a ruin than a safe house. The door creaked open as she pushed it, revealing a dimly lit interior. The girl looked up at her, her eyes wide. Is this really safe? She asked her, voice hesitant. The woman gave her a small, reassuring smile. It's the best we've got. As the bikers filed into the building, the woman closed the door behind them, sealing them in. She took a moment to scan the room, making sure there were no immediate threats. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of oil and rust lingered in the corners. It wasn't much, but it was a place to rest and regroup. The woman motioned for the group to settle in. We'll stay here until we know what's next, she said, her voice low. The girl needs rest. We need to keep moving, but we can't afford to make any mistakes. The girl, exhausted and overwhelmed, sank down onto one of the crates in the corner, her body trembling. The woman walked over to her, kneeling down. You did well, she said softly. You're strong. You've made it this far, and that's something to be proud of. The girl looked up at her, her eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, she whispered. I don't know how I would have survived without you. The woman smiled, her heart aching for the girl. We're not done yet, but we're here, and we're together, and that means something. The sound of footsteps approaching broke the moment. The woman turned, her hand immediately going her knife. But it was only one of the bikers, looking tired but resolute. We need to talk, he said. The woman nodded. What's happening? The biker's face was grim. They're getting closer. We don't have much time. The woman exhaled slowly, her mind racing. We need a plan, she said firmly. And we need to move out before they find us. As the group began to gather, the woman looked at the girl, who was now standing by her side, a quiet strength in her eyes. They had come so far, and they would keep going. The road ahead was uncertain, but together they would face whatever came their way, and they would fight no matter what. They had come this far, and they weren't going to stop now.